What's up, guys? Jeff from Worldwide Cyclery, and today we're going to talk about forks. Not those kind of forks, those kind of forks. All right, so this is going to be a quick video about the basics to upgrading the fork on your mountain bike. All the little attributes you got to check before you actually make that purchase and see what fork you need for your bike and what's going to actually fit. So let's get right into it. The first thing to consider is the fork type and the travel. So there's literally hundreds of bicycle types out there and fork types. So we're talking about mountain bike forks, which typically means 100 millimeters of travel all the way up to 200 millimeters of travel. There's a myriad of forks laying right in front of me right here, different travel ranges, and typically what you need is you want to stick within 20 millimeters of what your bike is supposed to come with. So if your bike is say a cross-country bike and it's got 100 mil travel in the front and 100 mil in the back, we don't recommend putting anything lower than 80 or anything more than 120, and that goes for almost anything. You can play around with that a little, but it's getting sketchy, right? Because you put a shorter travel than the bike's designed for, it's going to get really steep. You put a longer travel, it's going to get really slack. So you have to be careful there, and we recommend just try and keep it in with 20 millimeters of what the bike is actually designed to use. Aside from that, you're going to want the travel range pretty much defines the type of fork it is, right? So if it's a 160 mil travel fork, it's probably going to be an enduro fork. So if you're going to go to 170 or 150, it's probably going to be a very similar style type of fork. So keep that in mind. The next thing to consider is steer tube size. These days, most modern higher end mountain bikes, so when I say higher end, I mean like bikes $1,500, $2,000 and above, they're going to have a tapered steer tube. And what that looks like is right here. So it's tapered, it's a 1.5 here, and it goes to 1.125 right here. This is the most standard on higher end mountain bikes these days. There is a few exceptions. Cannondale's got some funky stuff, Giant's got some funky stuff, but for the most part, when you just hear tapered steerer, that's a 1.5 to 1.125 tapered fork, just like this. Older bikes and some other bikes, maybe like dirt jump bikes that have a steel frame, and a ton of older bikes are going to have an 1.125 steer. So it's going to be a straight 1.125 all the way, and that's like what you see right here on this fork. So pretty big difference between the tapered steer. The reason the tapered steer came out on mountain bikes is because of stiffness and weight. They were able to just make the whole fork flex less and actually shave some weight at the same time. So great upgrade. So if you can fit a tapered steer on your bike, you want to do that. And again, that's the most common on like high-end bikes these days. This is more common on a little bit older mountain bikes. And maybe like steel frame rigid mountain bikes or steel frame dirt jumpers might have a straight steer like this. There is some older steers as well. These are all threadless, meaning they don't actually have threads for the headset. We're not going to talk about the older stuff. That's probably pre-2005, I would say. And if your bike's older than 2005, you should probably just buy a whole new bike, because that's the way you should go, rather than just upgrading the fork on it, in my opinion.
No, God! No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Next thing, the wheel size. So 26, 27.5, 29, those are the three most common mountain bike wheel sizes right now. As of right now, it's really 27.5 and 29. You do want to pay attention to plus size as well. So you might have a plus size fork, meaning that it's made for a 2.8 to like 3.2 inch tire. Some of the forks are sort of cross compatible. They'll go up to like a 3.2 tire, but they'll work just fine if you're running a 2.3 or a 2.5 tire as well. Then of course you have your fat bike forks, but that's a whole different fat bike video. But pay attention to what wheel size fork you're buying. So if you got a 26-inch wheel fork, that's going to go on a 26-inch wheeled frame, 27.5, 29, yada yada. That one's pretty easy to figure out, but it's an important one to get right, and you can't really get that wrong. Next up is the offset of the fork. So the offset changes in the crown and sometimes the trail of the fork depending on the model and the bike. Trek kind of invented these new offsets. Man, it must have been quite a while ago. I think they invented the 51 mil offset fork for 29ers. And that's just something to pay attention to. So again, that boils down to like, what is your bike designed for? So if you look at your bike, hopefully it's still relevant enough that the manufacturer has got it on their website or maybe in their archives, and it will tell you what fork it comes with, how much travel, the wheel size, and hopefully the offset. And that's something to pay attention to. Again, it's not usually specified unless it's a 29er, because then it's like sometimes a 51 mil offset has actually become more common. Nowadays, brands like Transition bikes are doing some pretty unique stuff with different offset forks that are shortening the offset. So it's something to pay attention to. And again, it boils back down to what is your bike made for. If it's made for, say, a 29-inch wheeled fork that's got 150 mil travel and a 51 offset, those are the specs you need to get when you upgrade your fork. You might be able to add a little here or there to the travel, but pay attention to the specs that the bike was designed for. That's a super important thing. Next thing up is the axle. So there's a few different common axle types. Most general mountain bikes, a 15 mil axle is pretty common. There's non-boost, there's boost, there's 20 mil axles, there is the little bit older or on the little bit lower end bikes, the quick release axle, also known as like a 9 millimeter axle that doesn't actually have a through axle to it. So there's a number of different axle sizes. This can be a little challenging to figure out, and you could probably do some Googling and do some measuring of your own bike to figure that out, but you do want to pay attention to the axle. And again, you could, of course, say if you had this fork on your bike with a quick release axle on it, if you wanted to get a fork that had the same specs otherwise, wheel size, travel, steer tube, etc., but it had a 15 mil axle, you of course could do that. You're just going to need to adapt your front hub to it. So you could do that with an adapter kit, or you could do that with a whole new hub or whole new front wheel, etc. So there's a lot of different ways you can go wrong and a lot of other ways you can upgrade as well. Last thing is the brake mount. Most forks these days are coming with what's called a post mount, and that's where the caliper of the brake is actually just mounting directly on here, and there's two bolts that go right into the fork. Sometimes you're going to need an adapter, like this one right here is a post mount 160, so that means that if you put a caliper on here and a 160 mil travel rotor, you don't require an adapter. But if you need a 180 rotor per se, you wanted to run that on there, you would need an adapter. And some forks come with a post mount 180. So this fork right here, Fox 36, these come with a post mount 180. So that means you cannot run a 160 mil rotor on this fork. You're gonna take a caliper, it's gonna bolt on right here, and it's gonna fit to a 180 mil rotor. So pay attention to that. This is something, there's a million different brake adapters out there. That's a whole nother video. So you probably can convert, say if you had a 180 rotor on your bike right now, but it was using an IS mount, which is one of those mounts where there's two bolts going this way and then two bolts going that way, and you wanted to get a fork that had a post mount 180, it would work, and you just ditch that adapter. Brake mounts are very confusing, almost as bad as headsets and bottom brackets. A whole nother video on that. So those are sort of the basic guidelines to upgrading your fork. There's going to be a link below to a blog post that we wrote that's got blog post that we wrote.
There's going to be a link below.
All that stuff broken out in text if you want to check it out. And to be honest, our number one recommendation, suspension's a very commonly upgraded thing, especially forks. The thing we really recommend is just make it somebody else's problem, right? If you're having trouble figuring this stuff out for your bike, contact your local shop, contact us, contact your favorite retailer, contact your buddy who's a bike nerd or hopefully thinks he is, and ask them. Say, hey, can you help me upgrade my fork? How much travel do I have? What wheel size do I have? Blah, blah, blah. It's kind of easy to make that someone else's problem. And again, it's fun to do it yourself and figure out what you need, but they're pretty expensive purchases, right? I mean, typical forks are going to be $300 to $1,500. So when you're going to invest in a purchase like that, it's nice to know you're buying the right thing. So it's always good to talk to the retailer that you're buying it from and ask them like, hey, this is the bike I have. Here's a couple pictures of it. you know, is this going to fit? We do that all day at the shop here. We're constantly communicating with people over emails or over the phone, figuring out what fork actually fits their bike. So yeah, that's our recommendation, and those are the sort of the basic things to pay attention to. And let us know, have you guys upgraded your fork? If you did, how did it go? Did I miss anything? Did you guys have problems when you upgraded your fork? What are you riding now? Let us know everything you can in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.